Take two. I just had a good practice, a good 8-minute bio. We're going to shorten this to about 3 minutes here. Good morning. First off, I want to thank Androscoggin Bank for being the sponsor for this webinar education series. I'm Jim Chalmers with Chalmers Camp Insurance Program. And with us today, Drummond Woodson, who is going to spend some time speaking on the impact of cannabis legislation for Maine summer camps. This really stemmed from a conversation that started this past summer at Migas Lodge at a Maine summer camp board meeting. Some of you just watched me mouth my words for the last 10 minutes, so I'm gonna compact my introduction here briefly and just speak in the sense of, after that meeting at Migas Lodge, I knew exactly who to reach out to and talk to and see if Drummond Woodson, Hannah King would be willing to spend some time and share their thoughts and expertise on the cannabis industry for us. They're a law firm that spends, they represent about 80 to 90% of the school districts in the state. They've also helped with writing and part of the legislation for the state of Maine for the medical and I believe the recreational use, the adult use of marijuana as well. We are recording this, so it will be available for folks later on. You can certainly type in your questions, and Dan Rose and Hannah will certainly get to them, or as many as they can, and hopefully answer them for you, and for those of you that later on can share with others for this webinar. Again, I'm gonna shorten the bio reach here. Very impressive group, and we're excited to have Hannah and Dan present to us. But Hannah's the co-chair of Drummond Woodson's Regulated Substance of Practice. She does work with tribes across the country and marijuana businesses in Maine, Massachusetts, New Hampshire, and Vermont on marijuana licensing and regulatory issues. So certainly has quite the experience on that. Dan Rose is Drummond Woodson's practice group leader for labor and employment. His practice is focused on representation of private and public entities on employment and labor matters on a national level, but includes discrimination, wrongful discharge, wage and hour, workers' compensation issues. We have a lot to cover, so we certainly want to give them as much time as possible. So Hannah, I really appreciate your time. Dan, we'll do a handoff here and I'll give you your seat. So thank you.
Of course. Well, everyone, welcome to our webinar on the impact of cannabis legalization on Maine summer camps. We understand through our representation of schools and employers across the state that this is a huge issue that folks who work with minors, provide services for minors, and our employers are struggling with. And so I want to just kind of go through our agenda quickly. So we're planning today to talk first about the national trend towards legalization. I'm going to give you a brief overview of federal law, what's happening at the federal level. We'll talk about medical marijuana in Maine and adult use marijuana in Maine. And just so folks know, the language in this space is changing a little bit. So when I use the term adult use marijuana, I'm referring to recreational marijuana. I think there's been a conscious effort, particularly because nobody wants minors to be using marijuana. Recreational marijuana sounds fun. We're hoping adult use marijuana, is a little less enticing. So when I use the term adult use marijuana, I'm referring to recreational use marijuana. We're then going to talk a little bit about campers and kind of what your obligations are with regard to camper use of medical marijuana and or adult use marijuana. Dan is going to talk to you about your obligations as employers if you have employees that ask to use adult use marijuana or medical marijuana. And then I'm going to do a quick note on CBD products. These are ubiquitous in the state, but the legal status is really complicated, and so I want to just kind of put that on your radar. And then at the end, we'll take questions, and hopefully we'll have some answers for you. So national trends, I'm sure that folks have noticed that we really are seeing this trend towards legalization across the country. At this time, there are 33 states plus the District of Columbia and Puerto Rico that have legalized medical marijuana. There are 10 states plus the District of Columbia that have adult use marijuana, legalized adult use marijuana, and that includes Maine and Massachusetts and Vermont, so a significant portion of New England. There are more states that are moving towards adult use legalization. New Jersey and New Hampshire's legislatures are contemplating legalization. One of the interesting things we're seeing is that initially legalization has come from citizens' initiatives and the vote of the public. We're starting to see legislators realize that they're getting in-purpose legislation through that process and that this is something that people want. And so we are starting to see states legalize marijuana through the legislative process. And we're likely to see that in both New Jersey and New Hampshire in the near future. The newly elected governor of Connecticut ran on a platform of legalization, and the governor of New York has been very vocal about his support for legalizing adult-use marijuana. There's a couple of reasons why we're seeing this trend towards legalization. One is there's just this pretty significant change in public opinion. In 1969, 12% of the population supported legalizing marijuana. In October of 2017, a Gallup poll found that 64% of people were in support of legalizing both medical and adult use marijuana. If you break it down to just medical marijuana, it's about 76% of the population support legalization. It's also one of the only issues at the federal level that's getting bipartisan support. In addition to that, there's a lot of money to be made in the marijuana industry. Their predictions are that by 2025, nationally, it's going to be a $24 billion market. In Maine, if adult use marijuana comes online in 2020, which is the expected date for sales, by 2022, it's anticipated that it'll be a $225 million a year market for the state of Maine. To put that into perspective, it's going to fall right in between. Our lobster market is about $400 million, our potato market somewhere around $150 million. So it falls in between two of our kind of largest economic commodities, and it will not be an insignificant market. So what complicates marijuana legalization is that marijuana continues to be illegal under federal law. Production, processing, and sale of marijuana is completely illegal. Marijuana is a Schedule I drug under the Controlled Substances Act. Other Schedule I drugs include LSD and heroin. Schedule I drugs are considered the most dangerous drugs, and there are significant restrictions on Schedule I drugs, including really tight prohibitions on research, which is one of the reasons we have really limited research around marijuana. There have been, in light of the fact that states are starting to legalize marijuana, there have been some efforts to change its legal status at the federal level, but none of those have been successful so far. And so, the federal government has taken a couple of tacks. The Obama administration, I think they recognized this as a complicated states' rights issue, and they issued a series of policy memos instructing U.S. Attorney Generals not to interfere with state legalization efforts unless certain kind of enumerated federal enforcement priorities were implicated. This did not change the fact that marijuana was illegal at the federal level, but was essentially saying, look, we don't see this as a huge priority unless we're talking about cartel involvement, diversion to states where it's illegal, minor use, and so we're not going to use our limited resources to prosecute people who are operating in compliance with state law. Under the Trump administration, they've taken their policies a little less clear. We've seen a series of conflicting statements from the president. The former Attorney General, Jeff Sessions, rescinded the Cole memo in January of 2018 and instead instructed U.S. attorneys to exercise their discretion to prosecute on an individual basis, that there wasn't going to be this kind of umbrella policy that you couldn't or shouldn't prosecute state legal marijuana businesses, and if you wanted to as a U.S. prosecutor in Texas, but you didn't want to as a U.S. prosecutor in Maine, it was within your discretion. And this means that the views of local U.S. attorneys are really important. The U.S. attorney for the District of Maine has taken a really similar position to the Cole memo and said, look, this isn't a priority of ours, but if you are engaging in conduct that's outside the confines of state law, then we will prosecute you, and we have seen some prosecutions in the state. And again, there have been some legislative efforts to address the disconnect between federal and state law, and none have been successful. What we anticipate kind of the first step might be is something that codifies the Cole memo, so not national legalization of marijuana, but something that says, look, if you're operating in compliance with a state that has a robust regulatory regime, you won't be violating federal law. But if you're operating in a state that hasn't legalized, you will be. So medical marijuana in Maine. I'm going to give you a little bit of history first. Medical marijuana was first legalized in Maine in 1999. Maine was actually one of the first states to legalize medical marijuana. We did not, however, put in place any sort of commercial marketplace for medical marijuana until 2006. Maine's medical marijuana program is considered one of the more liberal systems in the country. Maine is one of the only states that has reciprocity, so we allow Maine businesses to sell medical marijuana to people from out of state who have medical marijuana cards from those states. Nevada is the only other state that does that. So 2006, there was a substantial overhaul that created a commercial sources for medical marijuana, and then the system was again substantially overhauled it's July of 2018, and I apologize, that's a typo. And that law just went into effect in December of 2018, and it really it made our law even more liberal and kind of candidly recognized some of the commercial aspects of medical marijuana that were not legal but were happening anyway. So I'm going to just give you kind of a brief overview of how medical marijuana in the state works. So the only people who are allowed to purchase medical marijuana are qualifying patients, and a qualifying patient has a right to use medical marijuana. The law used to require that in order to get a certification, not a prescription, prescriptions are federally approved drugs, but a certification pursuant to state law from a physician or a physician's assistant, an individual would have to have one of an enumerated list of qualifying conditions. And we see this across the country. Almost every state except for Maine now has a law that says you can only get medical marijuana if you have cancer or epilepsy, or some of the more liberal systems have kind of a broad catch-all, irretractable pain. In the overhaul that happened in 2018, the legislature removed the list of qualifying conditions. So Maine is now the only state where you can go to a doctor and a doctor can make an assessment about whether or not they feel like you would benefit from marijuana, regardless of whether or not you have a diagnosis, and they can issue a certification for use of medical marijuana. Certifications can be issued by either a physician or a nurse's practitioner that are licensed in the state of Maine. The law does require that you have a bona fide patient-provider relationship, and one of the changes to the law recently is that there has to be, at least for the initial issuance of a certification to use medical marijuana, there has to be an in-person exam by the physician. Minor qualifying patients. So minors are also entitled to access medical marijuana under certain conditions. So for minors, a physician or a physician's assistant can issue a certification for medical marijuana for individuals who are under the age of 18 if the patient has a medical diagnosis of epilepsy, cancer, or a developmental disability or an intellectual disability that in the medical provider's professional opinion may be alleviated by the therapeutic or palliative medical use of marijuana. So if an individual has one of those three things, the doctor can just issue the certification. Doctors can also issue certification for other reasons, but in order to do that for a minor qualifying patient in Maine, they do have to consult with a physician who is registered with the Department of Health and Human Services as having some sort of expertise or better understanding of medical marijuana. Because again, as a Schedule I drug, there's really been limited research around the actual effects of medical marijuana. Qualifying patients under the age of 18 may not smoke marijuana. They can only take marijuana in edible form. Smoking includes vaporizing. They cannot vaporize. They can't smoke marijuana flower. The definition of smoking does not include use of a nebulizer, though. That's clear. Where can patients get medical marijuana in Maine right now? They can grow it themselves if they're over the age of 18. If they're a minor, their parents, who would be a caregiver, parents have to consent before a minor can get a marijuana certification. A parent can get a caregiver card and can cultivate marijuana for their child who's a qualifying patient. They can buy it at one of 8 dispensaries in Maine. I think there's a lot of confusion right now because there's a lot of stores opening up, but the reality is that in Maine there are only 8 registered dispensaries, which are larger, more sophisticated operations. They're allowed to have unlimited plants and serve unlimited patients. They can also buy it from a medical marijuana caregiver. These are much smaller operations. They've gotten a little bit bigger since the change in the law, but there are around, there's actually now around 4,500 medical marijuana caregivers in the state of Maine. But that's the only place where you can legally purchase medical marijuana. Interestingly, there's no mandatory packaging or labeling standards for medical marijuana right now, and there's no mandatory testing. I'm going to talk to you a little bit about adult use marijuana in Maine. So adult use marijuana was legalized by Citizens Initiative in November of 2016. Shortly thereafter, the legislature, I think rightfully so, took a look at the law that was attached to the Citizens Initiative and felt that it was pretty significantly flawed, and they worked for about 2 years to pass and overhaul or rewrite that law. They passed the Marijuana Legalization Act in May of 2018. They're in the process right now of drafting regulations to implement that law. We do not think that those regulations are going to be drafted, and we're going to actually have licensed commercial operators until the end of 2019, beginning of 2020 at the earliest. And depending on what happens with the legislature with regard to approval of the regulations, that may be kicked out until 2021. Just some quick overview of the limitations on adult use. Adult use marijuana only authorizes possession and use of marijuana for individuals 21 years of age or older. Individuals can only consume adult use marijuana in a private residence. This includes curtilage, so the yard, but it has to be a private residence. They can also consume on private property that's not generally accessible to the public. They must have explicit permission from the property owner. So as a property owner, as a camp, you could theoretically give individuals permission to use adult use marijuana on your property, and they would be allowed. I'm assuming most camps are not generally accessible to the public, so under this particular provision, they would technically be allowed with your express permission to use adult use marijuana on campgrounds. Other limitations on adult use: people cannot use adult use marijuana while they're driving a vehicle, at a daycare or babysitting center during hours when children are there. Makes sense. In a designated smoking area, as provided by the Workplace Smoking Act, or in any public place or public area where smoking is prohibited. Again, there's really, folks, when the law passed, people were complaining that people were going to be walking down the street smoking marijuana, but really the only places that you can do it are on private property with permission of the owner and in your own home. So we don't have a commercial marketplace. There are no stores where people can go in and buy adult use marijuana. That's not going to happen until about 2020. And so what can people do right now under the law? An individual 21 years of age or older can possess up to 2.5 ounces of marijuana or 5 grams of concentrate. To give you an idea of what that looks like, that's 2.5 ounces of marijuana flower and 5 grams of hash. Adults can cultivate up to 3 plants on their own property for their own personal use. They can use marijuana in a private place, but again, there are no legal commercial sales. You cannot legally purchase adult use marijuana in the state of Maine right now. All right, so what does this mean for campers, for folks who are attending your summer camps? And I want to start by talking a little bit about both federal and state laws that require public accommodations, which a camp would be, to make reasonable accommodations for folks with disabilities to allow them to access the public accommodations. So you've got the Americans with Disabilities Act for school. If you have Section 504 of the Rehabilitation Act. There is